I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we bring you the latest news from Ukraine, look at how Russia has been blamed for jamming GPS signals on British military jets, and ask quite why Belarus, a country hosting Russian nuclear missiles, is rattling the nuclear sabre once more.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 1st of July, 2 years and 133 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Transport Correspondent Gareth Corfield, Data Editor Ben Butcher, and former tank commander turned chemical and biological weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started with the latest news from Ukraine. And firstly, President Zelensky has demanded the West lift weapon restrictions on targeting Russia after accusing Moscow's forces of dropping more than 800 glide bombs in a single week. Speaking on X, on Twitter, he said, "This week alone, Russia has used more than 800 guided aerial bombs against Ukraine, against our cities and communities, against our people, against everything that makes life normal." He said Ukraine needs the necessary means to destroy the carriers of these bombs, including Russian combat aircraft wherever they are. This step is essential. Now, on yesterday, Russia hit Ukraine's two largest cities with glide bombs, killing one, injuring, I think I've seen a dozen, but anyway, killing others, including injuring others, including an 8-month-old baby in Kharkiv. That was after a postal depot was targeted. In Kyiv, missile fragments damaged an apartment building, but there were no deaths reported. Mr. Zelensky, obviously, you will know, he's repeated his appeal for permission to strike further into Russia. He's speaking after 7 were killed and at least 38 injured strike on the southern Ukrainian town of Vilnyansk on Saturday evening. Speaking last night, he said long-range strikes and modern air defences are the foundation for stopping the daily Russian terror. Now, also over the weekend, a Russian ballistic missile attack on the southern city of Dnipro injured 7, damaged scores of residential buildings. This comes from Regional Governor Serhiy Lysak speaking earlier today. The drone and artillery attack on the Nicholls district late last night also damaged power and gas lines as well as other infrastructure. Starting off the weekend, after we were on air, there was a Russian strike on the city on Friday evening that destroyed the top 4 floors of an apartment building, killing at least 1 and wounding at least a dozen, including a 7-month-old girl. The images you'll see of that, the photographs in the social media, there's a large apartment block with just a whole chunk just bitten out of it. Now, the Ukrainian military said this morning it had repelled Russian attacks near Spierny and Novolysandrivka in the eastern Donetsk region. This was a day after Russian forces claimed to have taken control of both villages. They are to the northeast and southwest of Bakhmut. Just to put us on the map, picture Bakhmut, about 60 k's north of Donetsk city itself. I'll be talking more about this area in a moment. Now, the eastern Pokrovsk front, which is around this area, including these villages, remains the site of the fiercest fighting, apparently. Ukraine's general staff said 42 assaults have been repelled out of a total of 142 battles across the entire country just on Sunday alone. They said heavy fighting was taking place in the area around the villages yesterday. Elsewhere across the country, and I look to today's UK Defence Intelligence tweet, which has given more information there. They say in Vovchansk, so up the north and north of Kharkiv itself, fighting is reportedly focused on the aggregate plant there. Ukrainian forces are said to be attempting to dislodge Russian troops from the strong point that's in the southeast of the town. The town remains contested. We do know that Ukraine has made advances in the south and west of the town over the last couple of weeks. Elsewhere in the country, around Chasiv Yar in Donetsk, in the Donbass, there have been no confirmed Russian advances over the last 3 days, over the weekend. Combat's reportedly most intense in Ivaniska and Klishchivka to the south of Chasiv Yar. Ukrainian forces have reportedly counterattacked into Klishchiva, making tactical gains. Now, in the Kharkiv area, west of Donetsk city, Russian forces have made further advances with the town of Krasnoivka, around the town of Krasnoivka, and are now likely in control of most of the town. This is about 10 k's due west of Donetsk city itself. Ukrainian forces now only thought to be present in the extreme north of the settlement. UK Defence Intelligence say that area, kind of Avdiivka, Pokrovsk, so northwest of Donetsk city itself, that sector remains the probable Russian main effort and continues to see the highest Russian operational tempo. There have been minor advances across a broad front there, but UK British intelligence thinking that this area is going to be likely to remain the area of significant operational focus. That's where they seem to be putting most of their effort in. Next one, an interesting point here from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. They're saying the Russian military command appears to be separating some limited elements of the VDV. So these are the airborne forces. Before the war, they would have been considered elite. However, they've all been mostly been written down. So they are not the force they were. However, we know that Russia's been trying to build up the VDV again, if not actually in reality, but certainly on paper. But what they've done is the Russian military command appears to be separating them into smaller units, smaller components, and putting those across different sectors of the front. ISW say the Russian military command may still view the VDVs as relatively elite, obviously compared to other Russian units and formations. Now, this comes from analysis of announcements made by the Russian MOD and analysis of other OSINT, so open source intelligence, and Milblogger accounts, Russian and Ukrainian. For example, yesterday, Russian MOD said that elements of the 106th Airborne Division's 137th Regiment are operating in the Kherson area, which is, so they put these notices out, and ISW are able to crunch the numbers and try and work out the order of battle, where each unit was, or is and was, and therefore if there are elements well out of place, they've been subdivided. Now, ISW say the deployment of limited elements of the same VDV units and formations across different areas is at odds with standard military practice, and probably only possible by the direct order of General Valery Gerasimov, who's the head of the whole Russian armed forces, or possibly the VDV commander, General Mikhail Teplinsky. We know the VDV have been very heavily worn down over the last couple of years, now used as little more than mechanized infantry, but they may still, ISW assess, they may still retain some elements of higher quality, particularly if some of the generally higher quality officer cadre that started the war are still alive. So they'll be able to teach and train and try and rebuild, basically. However, I would say from my limited military experience, and Hamish, feel free to mention this later on, the tactic of using small numbers of high quality troops in order to stiffen the resolve or mentor lower quality units is a gamble. You often lose a lot by penny packeting larger forces, by diluting their effectiveness. Basically, I remember we used to have in the British Army, we used to put tank troops, so a troop of tanks, about 3 or 4 tanks, depending on the role, but generally 3 tanks, down to a battalion of 500 or 600 infantry soldiers, and the result was just too much dilution. That just didn't give the oomph of the armour to the battalion as was hoped. So that tactic was written off a couple of decades ago, and now you very rarely, as a tank squadron of about 12 tanks, 3 or 4 troops, very rarely broken down further, because you just lose too much by spreading it out too thinly. Okay, a couple more for me. Ukraine's security service say they have rounded up a group of what they call as provocateurs, accused of plotting to spark riots in Kyiv and seize Ukraine's parliament building. So the SBU, the security service, said, according to their investigation, the group was led by the co-founder of a public organisation that has been known for its anti-Ukrainian actions since 2015. The attackers plan to announce the removal from power of the current military political leadership of Ukraine. They then hope to seize the building of the Verkhovna Rada, that's the parliament of Ukraine, and block its work. The SBU said this organisation planned to spread disturbances that would shake up the social and political situation within our country, which would work in favour of the Russian Federation. The detainees are said to face up to 10 years in prison. So still the insider threat in Ukraine. Now then, President Zelensky, he's given an interview to the Philadelphia Inquirer. He said the White House is not yet prepared to invite Ukraine into NATO. Speaking to the Philadelphia Inquirer, he said, unfortunately, this is the policy of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And he said that the US And I think the tacit criticism went elsewhere as well, but he specifically mentioned the US was afraid to, in his words, annoy Vladimir Putin, adding, if NATO is not ready to protect us and to take us into the alliance, then we ask NATO to give us everything so that we can protect ourselves. And then just finally for me, interesting one here, a document obtained by the Washington Post suggests Russia has dropped glide bombs on its own territory dozens of times in the year up to 2024, April 2024, most likely due to malfunctioning guidance systems. So according to this document that's believed to have been written by the Belgorod City Emergency Department, they say 40 bombs have hit Belgorod in the last year, at least 4 on the city itself, quite a large city, 400,000 people, 7 in the surrounding suburbs, and dozens more in across the wider Belgorod Oblast. Now, the Washington Post cite Astra, that's an independent Russian media outlet, and they say they have verified that many of the incidents in the document did match those that have been collected from local governments and reports in the local news media. Astra estimates that Russia has accidentally dropped more than 100 bombs on its own territory, as well as occupied areas in eastern Ukraine over the past 4 months alone. So, I mean, we have seen this occasionally. If they are reported on at all, and Russian authorities don't often remark on them, they are written off as Ukrainian drone strikes or other such provocations. But I don't think I've ever seen. And there was, I think, was it a MiG-29 that piled in? So you couldn't really hide that. But otherwise, I don't think I can remember any moment when the Russian authorities have actually admitted, say that they did have dropped something on their own territory. This is usually on the way to firing them into Ukraine. Now then, enough of me. David and Francis are away after our very busy sort of weekend and stuff on the road with the pod. But I'm delighted that we've got Gaz back, Gareth Corfield, and equally delighted for the first time on the pod, we have data editor Ben Butcher. So, guys, you've written this amazing story. You've said Russia has jammed the GPS signal, global positioning satellite signal, on hundreds of Royal Air Force flights over Eastern Europe just this year, undoubtedly happening elsewhere, but the data you've looked at this year, including, and I see on the map that you've put with your article, there's a very heavy blob of activity of jamming around Syria and Israel and in the North Sea between Iceland and Norway, which I thought was quite interesting. But anyway, starter for 10. Gaz, what's going on there?
Thank you, Dom. It's always a pleasure to be back on, especially when there's something technologically nerdy to dig into, as we have here. So, yes, the story, which ran in the Sunday Telegraph, is also online, is that Russia has been jamming the GPS of hundreds of RAF air transport flights. And the interesting thing here is that we've focused specifically on the air transport fleet. We're not looking at frontline combat aircraft. We're not looking at little training aeroplanes doing their thing miles away. We're looking at the big transporters. We're looking at the Airbuses, the A330s, stroke Voyagers, the A400s. We've also included, just to give us a bit of interesting control data in there, the RC-135 rivet joint surveillance fleet. But before I go off into too much nerdy aviation detail here, what we're looking at is the extent to which GPS jamming has been taking place and the extent to which we can attribute that to Russia and also to the other countries who are involved in carrying it out. Now, as the map in the article suggests, and I know Ben will come on to this in greater depth in a moment, the map does suggest that the greatest extent of jamming experienced by the RAF when they're flying the transport fleet over the Med and over Europe, as broadly as you like to define Europe, is that we're seeing most of the jamming occurring up around the Baltics, up around the well-known Kaliningrad jammer. I'm third time lucky there. But also, yes, we do see elements of jamming around the coast of Norway. There's a particular hotspot just off the western tip of Norway as well, according to the map. And there's all the areas you'd expect to see around Eastern Europe, the borders with Ukraine and with Russia, particularly around the Estonia region, and also down towards the Black Sea. The data we have for the Black Sea is not as comprehensive as you might hope for. There's something about a war being on down there. But also tracking the map down further into the eastern Mediterranean, we're seeing substantial amounts of jamming activity from the Syria region, right the way down through Israel, through Syria, and down through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea beyond. So the picture we're seeing is that this is a substantial amount of GPS jamming going on. Most of it, but not all of it, most of it is linked to Russia and to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine at the moment. I think having skated over that, I shall now pass across to Ben Butcher, our data editor, who's going to go into a little more detail about what we found.
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of project is a data journalist's dream. We're given hundreds of thousands of rows of data from the people at Flight Radar, and we basically asked them for the information for 63 individual planes, and together that was around 4,700 flights. So with this, to get to the number, which was about 28% of all planes flying in Eastern Europe, we need to start by taking out the planes which don't actually go into that region, and that left us with around 500 people. We did that by looking at the latitude and longitudes of each flight, and keep in mind that if you have a long flight, that's going to be thousands of rows of data for each one, because every minute or so they're transmitting a location on the map which helps us put it into those blocks. Then we took those flights and we created little grids, which if you read the article you'll see those grids in the map below. And at that point we just took two numbers. We took the number of flights which flew through each of those grids, and we looked at the number of flights which had data which corresponded with jamming. And as you said, the highest areas in that part of the world are up in Finland. We had 10 flights that had flown through very close to the border with Russia up there, and 60% of them were received some form of jamming. And if you go down to Kaliningrad as well, we had around 30% of flights going through that region as well. So the numbers are very clear. We obviously also look at Western Europe to give us a bit of a comparison. And there are some flights that still get jammed there. I believe that is to do with sometimes I think national governments, and Gareth probably knows, do practice their own jamming systems as well, which might explain why numbers are actually not zero in areas you consider to be friendly. But it certainly shows that there definitely is something going on there, and also down in the Middle East.
Thanks, guys. So if I could jump in for a moment there, please, Gaz. So how serious is this? Can you situate this for us? What does the GPS do for the aircraft, and how significant is its loss? What other systems are available to compensate?
Sure thing, Dom. So the GPS aboard the RAF air transport fleets, it's essentially the same as you get in an airliner. So when Thea and me are jetting off to the sun-soaked beaches of Mallorca or wherever, these are exactly the same systems that are fitted to the RAF's Airbus transporters, to the C-17s, the sort of long-range heavy-lift cargo dedicated aircraft, and so on. These systems are used to tell the aeroplane and its pilots where you are and where you're going. So typical accuracy you're looking at here is probably tenths of a mile or so. And what happens when these systems are jammed is that, funnily enough, they stop working. But the failure modes can actually be quite impactful. Now, number one, you jam it, fair enough, it stops working. In the cockpit, typically, you get lots of red flashing warnings coming up saying GPS lost or GPS accuracy degraded or some such. That, when you're up in the cruise, when you're at 30,000 feet meandering along, is an annoyance. It's not necessarily safety critical there. Where it becomes safety critical, and we saw this earlier in the year with Grant Shapps when his flight had its GPS jammed by Russia, somewhere up near the Kaliningrad jammer in northeastern Poland. What happens when you're in lower airspace and you're reliant on GPS signal for precisely locating where your aeroplane is? That is a safety critical problem, because when that happens, you can no longer guarantee where you are. You might think, oh, right, well, I'm on the precise approach path for the airport, but suddenly it's gone off. I've got to make 3 more turns. I've got to do those at a precise distance and height and time from the airport. And now I can't do that because the main system I was relying on has been lost. Now, aviation folk tell me that GPS is part of a jigsaw, that there are actually many interleaved and interlayered systems which provide a redundancy and fallback for the instances when GPS jamming happens. Now, this is correct, this is true. We absolutely must not over-egg the pudding here. There are certainly fallback systems, not least of which is the ability for the pilot to look out of the window and see, I've got ground above, I've got ground below and I've got sky above. If those are the other way around, then there is a problem, definitely. No, there are ground-based radio beacons as well. Airports typically have systems called the Instrument Landing System, or ILS, which is a great big radio beam broadcast from the airport to say, runway here, land along this line. But aviation at the moment is very much getting on board with GPS-based location technologies. So in the instance of the Shapps flight, which has also come up in our 4 months of data analysis, the 40,000 flights we've looked through, the airport he was flying from its approach procedures are actually designed purely with reference to GPS, which is to say there is no ground-based radio beacon nearby. It's GPS or nout, or looking out the window the old-fashioned way if you're flying an aeroplane small enough and slow enough to do that safely. So the safety impact there is considerable. Aviation, as I've briefly mentioned already, is moving towards getting rid of ground-based radio beacons, which are expensive to buy and costly to run and maintain, in favour of the GPS signal, because, not to put too fine a point on it, GPS, and indeed other global navigation satellite systems, or GNSSs, as the technical acronym has it, are in fact free to use. You just get a receiver that can tune it in, and bingo, there you are. You might need an expensive receiver that's certified to a certain level of accuracy and all the rest of it, but it doesn't cost you anything other than buying that and maintaining it to whatever standard needs to be maintained. The actual satellite system, which everybody's relying on, is paid for by the US taxpayer. So, yes, the safety implications here are quite, I wouldn't say severe, but they are concerning. And if the impact of jamming gets worse, we could potentially see, so I'm told, a move back towards ground-based radio beacons for navigation. We could see, which in a way is a move backwards, a move to sort of 20th century grade technology again. I mean, there was an airport in eastern Estonia. Its name escapes me, and I'll look it up afterwards and put it on Twitter so everybody can check this one out. Also written about on the Telegraph, by the way. Airport in eastern Estonia where Finnair had to withdraw all of its flights for a month because of a new Russian GPS jammer set up across the way over the border. And the result for that was, the airport's approach procedures were purely GPS reliant. There was no ground-based radio beacon, so when the jammer started up, just like, we can't safely land here. Our navigation systems cannot tell us to within miles where we are, so we've got to abort, we've got to go back home. Sorry, everybody in the back. And yes, until the airport builds and installs a radio beacon, we won't be going back there again, said Finnair. And that was in May. So, yes, at this point, having nattered on for a bit, I shall pass it back to Ben, who doubtless has more to add.
I mean, I think one thing that is quite interesting, which showed up in the data, is we're talking about this from the Eastern European point of view. We're talking about it from the point of view of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. But there is also the other thing to add that actually, when you look at the figures, jamming is obviously very synonymous with conflict. If you go down to the Middle East, which is reclarified as the period, the location just south of Turkey down to Egypt, you had there around 45% of all flights being jammed in that area, compared to the 28% that we saw in Eastern Europe. So the jamming is higher there. But I imagine there is an element of that is something that is known by the RAF and is something that they factor into their navigation when they're flying over the region, as opposed to up in Finland or in Eastern Europe, and it might be more predictable because it isn't an ally doing the jamming. I don't know if that's something that you'd be familiar with. Is that something which...
Well, no, not very familiar, but I was going to ask, as I said at the start, what is going on in that area around the North Sea? On your map, you've got a sector there between Norway and Iceland that is also noted a very great spike in GPS jamming incidents. So I wonder if you could explain that, please.
Yeah, I mean, within the numbers, we had 33 flights flying over that one section there, which has come up particularly dark on the map. That's just off the coast of Norway. So we had 33 flights flying in that area, and 11 of them came back as being jammed. The numbers are high. Obviously, with this kind of stuff, when you have a slightly lower number of flights flying in an area, it might small anomalies might impact the data. And it is fair to point out that within these numbers, there are going to be anomalies, because we're looking at trends which are associated with jamming, which is a precision within the data which is below 6. So we're looking at that, and so it might be that there's anomalies which go on there. But it's also possible as well that you have some form of exercises going on there, NATO naval exercises, because some of those jammers will be located on ships and on other kind of equipment as well. So that could be part of it, that this is actually jamming which is done and tested by allies. And I think that is why we also see some numbers happening across Western Europe as allies try their systems against friendly equipment.
Sorry, Gaz, I thought you wanted to jump in and mention something about the area there and the Norway exercises on the back of what Ben was just saying.
Yes, indeed, Dom. So obviously the coast off Norway is a fairly common area that NATO uses for naval exercises, bringing large numbers of warships together to go through drills and rehearse responses to scenarios and different things and so on. As part of that, a large amount of it does consist of operating in what the military calls, or the Navy call, GPS-denied environment, or GNSS-denied environments. So what we're seeing on the map showing up off the western coast of Norway there, and obviously we need to go back and slice and dice the data again. I can see Ben already looking delighted at that idea. Is cross-reference those dates with NATO exercises in the area. Now, a critically important thing to note is that although the story we've written is about the impact of Russian jamming, which is blanket, indiscriminate, and to an extent broadly targeted, but not specifically aiming at anyone. The NATO naval exercises off Norway and indeed elsewhere in the North Sea and out in the Atlantic and so on are always well notified to aviators, in particular. The global NOTAM system, Notice to Air Missions is the acronym, does actually contain notifications good few weeks in advance saying GPS jamming within 20 miles of this particular latitude, longitude, this particular location. Take caution, stay away, whatever the caution may be. And the capabilities of jamming equipment used by what we call friendly navies is well known. Typically, those navigation warnings will have jamming within 20 miles of radius such, or jamming of up to 40,000 feet, or jamming north or northwest of a particular area. It's controlled, it's specified. We know where it's going to happen. We take the appropriate action to notify civil airlines and civil authorities ahead of time. In that way, it's a controlled and a responsible exercise, which I emphasise is completely different from the blanket jamming we're seeing from the Russian border, from Kaliningrad, and indeed down in the Med, down towards Israel and Syria and all those conflict hotspot areas down there. I hope that's slightly illustrative of the point there, Dom.
It was. Thanks, guys. Thank you and Ben so much for joining us today. I would now like to turn to Hamish DBG, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I'm just going to mute you there, guys. I'm going to turn to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon now. I note, Hamish, good morning, welcome. I notice Ukraine's border guard has dismissed reports suggesting it was reinforcing troop deployments along its border with Belarus, calling the rumours an information operation by Minsk with Moscow's support. Belarus claimed last week that Kyiv was bolstering its forces along the country's shared border, and this morning the Kremlin said that report was a cause for concern, which makes me think it was all tied in together. However, Border Guard spokesperson Andrei Demchenko told Ukrainian national TV today it's not the first time Belarus offers information about Ukraine presenting a threat and strengthening itself. This is another part of the information operation conducted by Belarus with support by Russia. Now, this comes after, yesterday, speaking to state-run news outlet Belta, Belarus's Chief of the General Staff, Pavel Muravenko, said that the country would use tactical nuclear weapons that Russia has deployed on its territory if the sovereignty or independence of Belarus was threatened. Now, no one's been talking about that, so Belarus has suddenly come out the blocks pretty quick with talking about nuclear stuff and talking about Kyiv building up on the border. Hamish, I know you think that story about the talk about nuclear stuff was rubbish, but you suggest it could be a false flag, and you're saying that it could mean that Britain's new Prime Minister on Friday, whoever that is, may well be dealing with a nuclear standoff on day one. Hamish, good afternoon. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon, Dom, guys. Good to be with you. The whole nuclear piece, which we've discussed often, I think it's no surprise that this week, with I'm not sure political turmoil is the right word, but in France and in the UK, that again the nuclear piece is being wafted around again. And as you say, Ukraine said this is a psychological operation to stir up mass panic, which generally is a nuclear piece. But I think it's worth unpacking it a little bit. So, as you say, Chief of the General Staff in Belarus is saying, I think he actually said something like, we are quite happy to use these tactical nuclear weapons. We know how to do it. We know everything around it. So if we unpack this, firstly, I am not convinced that the Russian tactical nuclear weapons, which are likely missiles, are actually in Belarus for a whole host of reasons. First of all, we know the Iskander missiles that fire these warheads are incredibly short supply, and we know that the Russians have been taking the nuclear warheads off and putting conventional ones on. It's very unlikely that Russian nuclear bombers would be stationed in Belarus. And when we come to what we call the kill chain or the shooting chain, I'm absolutely certain that Belarus, in any format, is involved in the Russian nuclear kill chain or shooting chain. Russians might decide to put some of these tactical nuclear weapons in friendly countries, but no way will they have any say on how they're used. So that to me is immediately to dismiss this again as false flag, or again part of the psychological operations, as we say. But again, it does create this panic. It does create some uncertainty around the place. So I think that's what it is. But one, again, restating, and for everybody who's listening who does a tactical nuclear weapon it's called battlefield. They say a small weapon. It's still 10 to 15 kilotons, 10,000 tons of conventional explosives, still a massive bomb. And of course, with the radiation that would ensue from that. I think also there is an inference in this, and in the Kyiv Independent, also suggestion that if NATO threatened Belarus, they would also use these weapons, which again, I think it just cannot happen. So it's part of the bluff and bluster at the moment that one's expecting. And it would be naive not to expect the Russians and the Belarusians and others trying to exploit any potential political issues in the West. We had the Biden-Trump debacle at the end of last week. And of course, we've got elections at the moment. So I think it's all part of it. And I expect to see a lot more of this sort of stuff over the next couple of weeks because, as you mentioned, we will probably have a new red button pusher come Friday. And although we as ex-military people know that these things are incredibly tightly controlled, and no doubt the first thing the new Prime Minister will be doing on Friday morning is being briefed on our nuclear deterrent. So, it's just a chance to exploit things in that guise.
Thanks, Hamish. Now, another thing that we've been looking at today that I know has crossed your desk, there are reports that Russian tank crews, T-90 crews, are receiving a new tank round, the Telnik, which appears to be a smart munition designed for fragmentation and specifically for attacking infantry. Now, you've said that you think that this new round is probably not the game changer Russian bots would have us believe. Why do you hold that opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I suppose, rather ironic that you and I and General Richard Sharif were discussing the development of tank warfare at the Chalk History Festival just a couple of days ago. And I think it's interesting that the Russians are obviously looking at these things. And I hope those people in the Ministry of Defence who are looking at the new British Challenger 3 are also looking at other elements to it. The T-90, which has not really performed terribly well in Ukraine. It's got a lot of vulnerabilities, but actually it's got some good stuff as well. 120 millimeter main gun, which not only are they this new sort of dispersion round will go through, they also fire anti-tank guided weapons through it. So in principle, I think it's quite good. But when you look at the detail, they're saying you need a very sophisticated fire control computer that will have some chip in this round that will make it detonate wherever you want. I can't quite see the sort of the operating procedure for it. It strikes me, it's similar to what you and I know as a HESH-RAN, high explosive squash head, which basically blows up either on a fuse or when it hits something and sends fragments all around. I mean, they're saying that it is only a 5 kilogram sort of warhead to do this. So, and the other thing that we've discussed a great deal is one of the challenges that the Russians are having, because they're getting through so many tanks and so many tank crews. The crews are literally new crews, people who've never been in a tank before, allegedly are getting 2 or 3 weeks training and then shoved into these things. And that's why they're performing so badly, because in 2 or 3 weeks, you might be able to just about train how to drive a tank, maybe fire it, although, a British tank crewmen would do a year or so's training to get proficient. But then to use tanks as they should be, and going back to your point earlier on about concentration of force, I think you're absolutely right. So I'm jumping back to a story half an hour ago where the great military strategist Clausewitz said, "Clout, don't dribble." In other words, concentrate your force and use it there. But in order to do that, you need to not only train on how you use your tank and all these various new rounds that they're going to have, but also how to use them en masse as troops, as squadrons, as regiments. So 3 together, 14 together, 50 odd together. And that's just not going to happen. So again, I think this is just part of the narrative that we see all the time coming out of Russia to try and give the impression that they're getting some sort of significant advantage here. Whereas this, to me, is really part of that, but another element to it. But my final point here is going back to our discussions on where we go. We talked last week about the Frankenstein tank, the Leopard 1 hull with a Sky Ranger 35 millimeter cannon on it for shooting down drones. Actually, if you put an anti-tank guided weapon on that, you're now getting a very sort of capable armoured platform that can not only knock down drones, but can knock down other tanks. So, yeah, it's not something that I think people at Porton Down, the MOD's defence laboratory, where they look at how to do all these sort of countermeasures, will probably be worrying about too much. This is just part of, again, the noise coming out of Russian propaganda.
Thanks, Hamish. And you're absolutely right to note that you and I are joined by retired General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and also joined by John Buckley, Professor of Military History at the University of Wolverhampton. He's in the Department of History, Politics and War Studies. We were on stage at the Chalk History Festival on Thursday, discussing the future of the tank. I think you'll be able to watch them back. I think Chalk do put them all online. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hamish, but if they're not online, then just stay where you are for a year and hopefully we'll be invited back. We'll talk all
I
about
think
it.
you're right, Tom. I think though, and certainly speaking to David Nicholls, who's, I don't know if he's on holiday or elsewhere, but the digital whiz of the Telegraph, I think he was expecting to get a copy of the voice recording from that, and hopefully the Telegraph will put it up at some stage.
Yeah, we certainly got the recording. That'll be out, I think, in the next couple of weeks. But there's lots more that was on at Chalk. Well worth a look if their website covers that sort of stuff. Hamish, while you're on, I mentioned earlier on that analysis from the Institute of the Study of War suggesting that Russian airborne forces might be penny packeting out, trying to take smaller units to as I suggested, either stiffen the resolve or train and mentor other units. And I made the point that I remember when we tried that with tanks in the British Army. What's your view on taking a specialised force and pulling it apart, hoping that they can spread the love? Vice, it becomes too diluted. Where do you stand on that one?
No, I think, Dom, I stand the same as you. Doing this sort of thing on the hoof in combat, if you like, is, I can't think of an example where it's worked particularly well. If these airborne troops are taking sort of bog standard line troops out of the line to train them over a couple of months, then fair enough. And certainly when we used to send training teams all over the world of specialists, perhaps special forces guys and others, but to use them to bolster, come on, follow me, chaps, I'm an airborne warrior. I think that's dissipating your quality rather than reinforcing. And these things generally people tend to degrade to the lowest common denominator rather than the other way. So I think it's part of the sort of noise coming out of, as you said earlier, the bots. I can't see that it were. I mean, you put a troop of SAS in a normal sort of regiment, as it were, and it's not going to turn that regiment into a regiment of special forces soldiers. Certainly not without a couple of years training. So I agree with your view on that one.
Thanks. Let's move to final thoughts now. I noticed Gaz and Ben have had to dash back to the DigiDesk, so they've already legged it. But I'll go first, if I may, Hamish. I note that today, it's 1 year ago today, that writer, poet and friend of the pod, Victoria Amelina, was killed in a Russian missile strike on a restaurant in Kramatorsk. Now, the London Ukrainian Review has published a special issue dedicated to Victoria, And the book that she was writing when she was killed, which is a collection of testimonies about Russian war crimes in Ukraine, is going to be published early next year. We note your passing and remember you, Victoria, and we'll put links to the London Ukrainian Review piece and the link to where you can pre-order her book, if you so wish, in the episode notes today. Hamish, final thought, if you have one, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that. There's a very good piece in the Financial Times today by an ex-MOD civil servant about the state of the British military and the fact that although we agree, I think, or certainly my view is the British military is still pound for pound the best in the world, it does require a really good look at to make sure that we can meet the current threats that we talk about every day on the pod and all the rest of it. And a slight nod to my earlier piece on the nuclear side. Sometime on Friday morning, we are in effect going to have a new commander-in-chief. I know that we don't call it like that, but the Prime Minister of this country generally is the arbiter of how we react, not only politically, but also militarily. And we are in such challenging times at the moment. You know, we have never been closer to war in Europe than perhaps we were before the Second World War. We've been talking about the nuclear peace and everything else. It is a very challenging place. And the new government are really going to have to get to grips with that, I would suggest, almost before anything else. Because one thing we know about Putin, and he is the person that we must defend ourselves against, he exploits weakness and he is impressed by strength. One of the reasons he invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, he looked west and he didn't see a conventional deterrent that he thought would affect him. And our new government on Friday need to be absolutely all over that and expect a lot more of this sort of disinformation and propaganda coming out of the Kremlin and Belarus and other Russian supporters over the next few weeks. But I am sure that there is enough corporate knowledge and there is enough advice that's going to be given to the new government to make sure that we don't slip up. But I think people just need to keep their nerve, keep above their eye on all of these things, because it is a challenging time.
It certainly is. Thanks, Hamish. And yes, if anybody has not noticed, we've got a general election here in the UK on Thursday. I'm going to be working through the night. I'm going to be covering the constituency seat of Grant Shapps, who's our current Defence Secretary. The numbers there, his majority, suggests he may be vulnerable, although quite frankly, all the polling at the moment is so unusual and a little bit all over the place that nobody can really tell what's going to happen. But there's a chance that the Defence Secretary might not. I mean, it's looking like Labour is going to form the next government, in which case Grant Shapps will no longer be our Defence Secretary, but he may not even have a seat. He might be booted out of Parliament. That's how first past the post works. So I'm going to be covering his constituency, expecting the result there about 3:30 in the morning. So, pod the day before, pod the day after, feeling a bit shabby, but I'll be reporting from there through the night, as will my colleagues elsewhere, because we're expecting some big beasts to fall. But all that to come. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear, Rachel Porter and Georgia Cohen. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.